I pretended I had lost everything, the house, the car, the job. I wanted to test my family. My wife said, I wasn't born to live on scraps. My son refused to help. My wife is ashamed of you. I slept on the street that night, but when a homeless boy offered me a bowl of bone soup, I felt something. The next day, I decided to do something that would change everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Harold, and at 64 years old, I made a decision that would either destroy my family or reveal who they truly were. After 42 years of marriage and 38 years building what everyone called a business empire, I decided to test the people I loved most. I pretended I had lost everything. The morning I chose to begin this charade, I sat in my home office staring at the family photo on my mahogany desk. Margaret, my wife of 4 decades, smiled back at me with those green eyes that once made my heart skip. Our son David stood behind us, his arm around his wife Elena, both looking prosperous and content. I had given them everything: the house, the cars, the private school education, the college tuition, the wedding that cost more than most people make in 2 years. I had worked 18-hour days, missed countless dinners, skipped vacations, all to ensure they never wanted for anything. But lately, something had been gnawing at me. The way Margaret's eyes would glaze over when I talked about retirement. How David only called when he needed money or when Elena pushed him to maintain appearances. The conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. The feeling that I had become nothing more than a walking bank account to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. So I crafted my lie carefully. I told them the construction company had failed, that bad investments had wiped out our savings, that creditors were seizing everything. I made it sound convincing. Detailed stories about market crashes and betrayals by business partners. I even printed fake legal documents to make it appear official. The morning I broke the news, Margaret was in our kitchen making her usual cup of Earl Grey tea. She wore her silk robe, the expensive one I had bought her for our last anniversary. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the marble countertop as I spoke. "Margaret, we need to talk," I said, my voice deliberately shaky. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this, but there's no easy way. We've lost everything." She set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "What do you mean, lost everything?" I launched into my rehearsed explanation, watching her face carefully. At first there was shock, then confusion, but what followed made my stomach drop. Her expression didn't soften into concern for me or for us. Instead, her lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. "How could you let this happen, Harold?" Her voice was cold, calculating. "How could you be so careless with our future?" Not our future together. Our future, as if mine no longer mattered. "The bank is foreclosing on the house next week," I continued, my heart pounding as I delivered each fabricated detail. "We'll have to move out. I don't know where we'll go." Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile floor. She paced to the window overlooking our perfectly manicured garden, the one she had spent thousands of dollars landscaping just last spring. "I wasn't born to live on scraps, Harold," she said without turning around. "I won't do it. I simply won't." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not, "We'll figure this out together," or "Money doesn't matter as long as we have each other." Just a flat refusal to stand by me when times got tough. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly what she meant. She turned to face me, her expression eerily calm. "I'm saying that I need to think about my options. I have friends, Harold. People who can help me maintain a certain standard of living." The conversation with David went even worse. I called him that afternoon, asking if we could meet for lunch. He agreed reluctantly, claiming he was busy with work. We met at the diner where I used to take him as a child, back when a $5 meal felt like a special treat to him. David arrived 20 minutes late, checking his phone constantly as I explained the supposed financial catastrophe. When I finished, he leaned back in the booth and let out a long sigh. "Dad, I have to be honest with you," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Elena and we've worked really hard to build our reputation in this community. Her family has connections, important ones. If word gets out that you're financially unstable, it could really hurt us. I felt something crack inside my chest. Son, I'm not asking for your money. I'm just telling you what's happening to our family. David's jaw tightened. That's just it, Dad. Elena's embarrassed. She's worried about what people will think if they find out her father-in-law is broke. It reflects on us, you know. So what are you suggesting? He shifted uncomfortably, finally looking directly at me. Maybe it would be better if you kept your distance for a while, just until you get back on your feet. Elena thinks it might be best if we don't associate publicly. The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. My own son, the boy I had coached in Little League, taught to drive, walked down the aisle at his wedding, was asking me to disappear from his life because my imaginary poverty might embarrass his wife. I see, I said quietly. And if I don't get back on my feet? If this is permanent? David's silence was answer enough. That evening I packed a single duffel bag with a few changes of clothes and left the house. Margaret was in the living room on the phone with someone, laughing softly. She didn't even look up when I walked past. I had told her I was going to spend the night figuring things out, maybe stay at a motel until we could make plans. She had simply nodded and waved me away like I was a minor inconvenience. I drove to the poorest part of town, parked my car several blocks away where it wouldn't be recognized, and walked to a homeless shelter I had donated to for years but never actually visited. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had written checks to help strangers, but my own family wouldn't offer me so much as a couch to sleep on. The shelter was full, and I found myself on the street for the first time in my life. I sat on a bench in a small park, my duffel bag clutched against my chest, and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 12 hours, the two people I loved most in the world had essentially told me I was no longer welcome in their lives. The night air was cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. A few feet away, a shopping cart rattled as an elderly woman pushed it slowly past, all her worldly possessions contained within its rusty frame. I wondered if this was my future now. Not because I was actually poor, but because the people who were supposed to catch me when I fell had instead stepped aside and let me hit the ground. As I sat there in the darkness, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and trying to understand how my life had unraveled so quickly, one thought kept returning to haunt me. Maybe I had never really known my family at all. The second night on the streets taught me more about human nature than 40 years in business ever had. I woke up on that park bench with my back screaming and my dignity in tatters, but something else had awakened in me too, a clarity I hadn't expected. I spent the morning walking through parts of the city I had driven past countless times but never really seen. The unemployment office, the food bank, the community center where people lined up for free meals. These weren't just statistics anymore. These were real people with real stories, and I was now one of them. At least in appearance. It was around noon when I met Tommy. I was sitting outside a convenience store trying to figure out my next move when this kid approached me. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, wearing clothes that had seen better days and shoes with holes that let the cold seep through. His dark hair was uncombed and he had that look, the one kids get when they've had to grow up too fast. "Hey, mister," he said, his voice cautious but not unkind. "You look hungry." I was about to tell him I was fine, that I didn't need charity from a child, but something in his eyes stopped me. This kid understood hunger in a way I was only beginning to comprehend. "I'm okay, son," I said instead, "but thank you." Tommy studied me for a moment, then reached into a small backpack that looked like it had been rescued from a dumpster. He pulled out a thermos and a plastic spoon. "My mom used to make bone soup," he said, unscrewing the lid. "Before she got sick. I learned how to make it myself. It's not much, but it fills you up." The smell that rose from that thermos was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not because it was particularly appetizing, it was thin and watery, but because it represented something I had forgotten existed. Pure, uncomplicated kindness. "I can't take your food," I protested. Tommy shrugged. "I got enough for both of us. Besides, my grandma always said food tastes better when you share it. We sat there on the sidewalk, passing that thermos back and forth like it was the finest meal money could buy. Tommy told me his story between sips. His mother had died of cancer 2 years ago. His father had never been in the picture. He had been bouncing between relatives who didn't want him and foster homes that were overcrowded and underfunded. "Most people look right through you when you're like this," he said, gesturing to his worn clothes. "Like you're invisible or something, but you see everything they don't want you to see." His words hit me harder than I expected. Here was this child who had every reason to be bitter and angry, sharing his only meal with a stranger. Meanwhile, my own family, people who had never known real hardship, had turned their backs on me the moment things got difficult. While Tommy and I shared that simple soup, I decided to check in on my family. Not to crawl back begging, but to see how they were handling my absence. What I discovered made my blood run cold. I drove past my house, our house, and saw Margaret's car in the driveway alongside one I didn't recognize. A black BMW with expensive rims. I parked down the street and watched as a man I had never seen before emerged from my front door. He was younger than me, well-dressed, confident. He kissed Margaret goodbye like he belonged there. The shock of it nearly made me sick. This wasn't a new development. The way they moved together, the casual intimacy. This had been going on for a while. Maybe years. I followed the BMW to an upscale coffee shop downtown and observed from my car as this stranger met with other people, conducting what looked like business meetings. Eventually, I worked up the courage to go inside and ask the barista about him. "Oh, that's Robert Mitchell," she said cheerfully. "He's a regular, real estate developer, I think, always talking about big deals and new projects." Robert Mitchell. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't place it immediately. Then it hit me. He was the developer who had tried to buy out several of my construction sites over the years. I had always refused his offers, considering them lowball attempts. Now he was in my house, kissing my wife. The revelation about Margaret was devastating enough, but what I discovered about David was even worse. I drove to his office building and waited in the parking garage until he came out for lunch. Instead of going to a restaurant, he went to a casino on the outskirts of town. I followed him inside, staying far enough back to avoid detection. What I saw made my heart sink. David wasn't there for a casual meal or entertainment. He was at the poker tables, and from the desperate look on his face and the stack of chips in front of him, this wasn't his first visit. I watched for over an hour as he lost hand after hand, his frustration growing with each failed bet. When he finally left, I heard him on the phone with someone. "I know I'm behind on payments," he was saying, his voice strained, "but I can get the money. My dad's got assets we can liquidate. Just give me another week." My dad's assets. He was gambling with money he thought he would inherit, money he assumed would always be there to bail him out of his mistakes. That evening, I returned to the park where I had met Tommy. He was there again, setting up what looked like a makeshift camp behind some bushes. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Hey, soup guy," he called out. "How'd your day go?" I sat down beside him, feeling older than my 64 years. "I learned some things about my family today, things I wish I hadn't." Tommy nodded knowingly. "Yeah, families can be weird. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the worst." "Is that what happened to you?" He was quiet for a moment, arranging his few possessions in his small space. "My uncle told me he'd take care of me after Mom died, but really he just wanted the Social Security money. When that ran out, he said I was too much trouble and dropped me off at a group home. Said it was temporary, but that was 8 months ago." I felt my chest tighten. Here was this child, abandoned by adults who should have protected him, and yet he had more compassion in his little finger than my entire family had shown me in decades. "Tommy," I said carefully, "what if someone wanted to help you? Really help you, not just for money or because they had to?" He looked at me with those wise, old eyes. I guess I'd wonder what they wanted in return. Adults always want something. His honesty was like a mirror reflecting all the transactional relationships I had built over the years. Even with my own family, everything had become about what I could provide, not who I was as a person. As we settled in for another night under the stars, I made a decision. Tomorrow I would begin gathering evidence about what Margaret and David were really up to. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal, because something told me that what I had discovered today was just the beginning. The third day of my supposed downfall brought revelations that shattered everything I thought I knew about the people I had spent my life loving and protecting. What started as a test of their loyalty had become an excavation of lies. That ran deeper than I could have imagined. I woke up in the park with Tommy beside me, the kid having insisted we stick together for safety. As he shared another simple breakfast with me, crackers he had gotten from a food bank, I realized I needed to dig deeper into what Margaret and David were really doing. The glimpses I had caught the day before felt like just the tip of an iceberg. "I need to go take care of some business today," I told Tommy as we packed up our makeshift camp. "Will you be okay on your own?" He gave me that wise look again, the one that seemed too old for his 12-year-old face. "You're not really homeless, are you?" The question caught me off guard. "What makes you say that?" "Your hands," he said simply. "They're soft, and your teeth are too clean. Plus, you don't smell like someone who's been on the streets for months." I stared at him, realizing that this child had more street smarts than I had given him credit for. There was no point in lying to him. "You're right," I admitted. "I'm trying to figure out if my family really loves me, or if they just love what I can give them." Tommy nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Adults do weird tests sometimes. My mom used to say that people show you who they really are when they think nobody's watching." His mother had been wiser than she knew. I spent the morning following Robert Mitchell, the man I had seen leaving my house. It wasn't difficult. His BMW stood out and his routine seemed predictable. He went to a high-end gym, then to an office building downtown where he apparently ran his real estate development company. But it was his lunch meeting that provided the breakthrough I wasn't prepared for. I watched from across the restaurant as Robert sat down with Margaret. Not a chance encounter. This was clearly planned. They ordered wine, held hands across the table, and spoke in the intimate way of people who had been together for a long time. At one point, Margaret pulled out what looked like house keys and slid them across the table to him. My house keys. I felt sick to my stomach as the implications hit me. This wasn't just an affair. Margaret was giving him access to everything I owned. But why would she need to do that unless... The answer came to me like a punch to the gut, unless they were planning to take it all. I followed Margaret after lunch, staying several cars back as she drove not to our house, but to a luxury apartment complex across town. She used a key card to enter the parking garage, clearly familiar with the place. This wasn't a casual visit. She had been living a double life. The apartment directory in the lobby listed R. Mitchell in Unit 1207. Margaret had been maintaining a second residence with her lover while I worked myself to exhaustion to maintain the lifestyle she claimed to need. But the real shock came when I checked the apartment's lease information through a contact I still had at the property management company. The lease had been signed 8 years ago. 8 years. Margaret had been planning her exit from our marriage for nearly a decade, and I had been too blind to see it. That afternoon, I decided to investigate David's situation more thoroughly. If Margaret had been deceiving me for years, what had my son been hiding? I went to his office building and struck up conversations with people in the lobby, pretending to be a potential client looking for information about David's company. What I learned made my blood run cold. "Oh, David Hendricks," said a woman who worked for an accounting firm in the same building. "I heard his company's been having some serious cash flow problems. Word is, he owes money to some pretty dangerous people." Dangerous people? My son wasn't just gambling, he was in debt to loan sharks. I called an old friend who worked in banking and asked him to do some discreet checking on David's financial situation. What he told me a few hours later confirmed my worst fears. "Harold, I don't know what your son has gotten himself into, but his business accounts have been overdrawn repeatedly for the past 6 months. He's been taking cash advances on multiple credit cards, and from what I can see, most of that money has been going to casinos and offshore betting sites. How much are we talking about? I asked, dreading the answer. Conservative estimate? He's probably into debt for at least $200,000, maybe more. $200,000. Money he didn't have, borrowed against expectations of an inheritance he thought was guaranteed. But the conversation with my banker friend revealed something even more disturbing. Harold, there's something else you should know. Someone's been making inquiries about your business accounts and property holdings. Official inquiries with paperwork that suggests they might have legal standing to access that information. What kind of legal standing? The kind that comes with power of attorney or estate planning documents. Have you recently updated your will or given anyone financial authority over your assets? I hadn't. But that didn't mean someone hadn't forged documents to make it appear that I had. That evening I met Tommy back at our usual spot in the park. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "Bad day?" he asked, settling down beside me with a small bag of food he had managed to collect from various sources. "I'm learning that the people I trusted most have been planning to rob me blind," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Tommy unwrapped a sandwich and offered me half. "My uncle did something like that. After my mom died, he was supposed to take care of me. But really, he just wanted the survivor benefits and the money from selling Mom's stuff. When I figured it out and tried to tell the social worker, he said I was lying and making up stories because I was traumatized. What happened? He kept all the money and dumped me in foster care when the benefits ran out. But before he did, I heard him on the phone with his girlfriend, laughing about how easy it had been to fool everyone." I felt a surge of anger on Tommy's behalf, but also recognition. Margaret and David weren't just betraying me, they were laughing about it, confident that I would never discover their plans. "Tommy," I said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I might need some help gathering evidence against people who are trying to steal from me?" His eyes lit up with understanding. "I'd say that kids like me are basically invisible to adults. We see everything, but nobody thinks we're smart enough to understand what we're seeing." That night, as we prepared to sleep under the stars again, I began forming a plan. Margaret and David thought they were so clever, playing the long game while I remained oblivious, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. More importantly, they had never considered that I might have allies they couldn't see coming. The next morning, I would begin the most important investigation of my life. Not to build a case for business expansion or to negotiate a construction contract, but to uncover the full scope of my family's betrayal and figure out how to protect myself from the people who were supposed to love me most. But first, I needed to make sure Tommy understood what he was getting involved in, because something told me that what we discovered next would be far worse than anything I had imagined so far. What I discovered in the following days destroyed any remaining hope I had that my family's betrayal might have limits. Working with Tommy, who proved to be an invaluable ally in ways I never could have anticipated, I uncovered a conspiracy so methodical and cruel that it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about human nature. Tommy had been right about being invisible to adults. His youth and shabby appearance made him the perfect reconnaissance agent. While I fed him information about where to go and what to look for, he could observe and listen without raising suspicion. It was a partnership born of mutual abandonment, both of us cast aside by people who should have protected us. The breakthrough came when Tommy overheard a conversation between Margaret and Robert at a coffee shop near the real estate office. He had been sitting in a corner with a newspaper someone had left behind, pretending to read while actually listening to every word they said. "She talked for almost an hour," Tommy reported back to me that evening. "The woman, your wife, she kept saying things like, 'Once Harold's out of the picture,' and 'when we have full control.' The man kept telling her to be patient, that their plan was working perfectly." My hands clenched involuntarily. "What else did they say?" The scary part was when they talked about papers. Legal papers. The woman said something about how Harold would never know what hit him, and that by the time he figured it out, it would be too late to stop them. Legal papers. The pieces were starting to come together in the most horrifying way possible. The next day, I took a risk and called my attorney, James Morrison, who had handled my business and personal legal matters for over 15 years. I told him I was conducting a confidential review of my estate planning and needed to know if anyone had been in contact with his office recently about my affairs. What he told me made my blood freeze. "Harold, that's strange that you ask. Just last week I received a call from someone claiming to be your wife's attorney. They were inquiring about your will and asking about procedures for emergency power of attorney in cases of mental incapacity." Mental incapacity. They were asking very specific questions about what it would take to have someone declared unable to manage their own affairs. I told them I couldn't discuss your personal matters without your direct authorization, but they seemed to already know quite a bit about your financial situation. I felt the world tilt beneath me. "James, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to keep this completely confidential. I want you to check if any documents have been filed anywhere with my signature that I didn't actually sign." There was a long pause. "Harold, that's a very serious allegation. Are you suggesting someone might be forging your signature?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm asking you to investigate." 2 days later, James called me back with news that confirmed my worst fears. "Harold, we need to meet immediately. What I've found, you're not going to believe this." We met at a small diner on the edge of town, far from anywhere Margaret or David might expect to find me. James spread out a collection of documents on the table between us, his face grim. "Someone has been very busy with your paperwork," he said. "I found records of 3 separate legal filings that bear your signature, all of them dated within the past 2 months. My heart hammered against my ribs. "What kind of filings?" "The first is a revised will that leaves everything to your wife, with your son as executor. The second is a power of attorney document that gives your wife full control over your finances in case of mental incapacity. The third is a preliminary commitment order for a private care facility." I stared at the documents, recognizing my signature on each one even though I had never seen them before in my life. The forgeries were excellent. Whoever had done this had practiced extensively. "The commitment order is the most concerning," James continued. "It's a preliminary filing that would allow for emergency psychiatric evaluation and potential involuntary commitment if certain criteria are met." "What criteria?" "Basically, if 2 licensed physicians and a family member attest that you're a danger to yourself or others due to mental illness or cognitive decline, this document would fast-track your commitment to a facility." The room seemed to spin around me. They weren't just planning to steal my money. They were planning to have me declared insane and locked away. "James, how would something like this work in practice?" His expression was troubled. "If they could demonstrate that you were behaving erratically, say if you were found living on the streets, acting paranoid, making accusations against family members, and if they had medical professionals willing to support their claims, they could have you committed within 72 hours. I felt sick. My pretense of being homeless and destitute hadn't just been a test. It had provided them with exactly the evidence they needed to support their case for my mental incompetence. "There's more," James said quietly. "I did some checking on the care facility mentioned in the commitment order. It's a private institution that specializes in long-term care for patients with severe cognitive impairment. Once someone is admitted there, it's extremely difficult to get them released." "How difficult?" "The average stay is 18 months to 3 years. Many patients never leave." I sat back in the booth, trying to process the magnitude of what my family had planned. It wasn't enough for them to abandon me when they thought I was poor. They had actively conspired to steal everything I owned and then warehouse me in an institution where I couldn't fight back. But James wasn't finished with his revelations. "Harold, I also looked into the real estate transactions you asked me to check. In the past 6 weeks, preliminary paperwork has been filed to transfer ownership of 4 of your properties to something called Mitchell Development Holdings." Robert Mitchell. Of course. "The transfers haven't been completed yet, but all the groundwork is in place. Once the power of attorney documents are activated, your wife would have the legal authority to complete these sales. I thought about Margaret sitting in that restaurant with Robert, sliding my house keys across the table to him. She hadn't just been giving him access to our home, she had been giving him access to my entire life's work. That evening I found Tommy waiting for me in our usual spot. But he wasn't alone. A girl who looked to be about his age sat beside him, thin and wary-eyed. "This is Sarah," Tommy said. "She's been staying at the shelter, but they're full up tonight. I told her you were okay." I nodded to the girl, who watched me with the same cautious intelligence I had learned to recognize in Tommy, another child abandoned by the adults who should have protected her. "Sarah heard something today that you need to know," Tommy continued. "Tell him what you heard at the hospital." Sarah's voice was quiet but clear. "I was in the emergency room today. Got hurt when some older kids threw rocks at me. While I was waiting, I heard two doctors talking about a patient they were expecting. They said someone had paid them to evaluate an older man for psychiatric commitment and that the evaluation was supposed to happen tomorrow." My blood turned to ice. "Did they mention a name?" "They said Harold something, and that his family was very concerned about his mental state." I closed my eyes, feeling the walls closing in around me. Tomorrow. They were planning to spring their trap tomorrow. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "They said the man's wife and son were coming in the morning to discuss the situation. They seemed to already know what the evaluation was going to conclude." I looked at Tommy and Sarah, these two children who had been discarded by society, but who had more loyalty and courage than my own flesh and blood. They had risked themselves to warn me about a danger I hadn't even seen coming. "Kids," I said carefully, "what I'm about to tell you might sound crazy, but I need you to trust me. Tomorrow we're going to do something that will change all of our lives forever." Because I finally understood what I was really dealing with. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a systematic destruction of my life, planned and executed by people who had smiled at me across dinner tables for decades. But they had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had assumed I would remain helpless and alone. They had never considered that sometimes the people who save you are the ones nobody else bothers to see. The night before my family planned to have me committed, I sat with Tommy and Sarah in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, finalizing a plan that would either save my life or destroy what remained of it. These two children, cast aside by a world that had forgotten them, had become my most trusted allies in a war I never saw coming. "Okay," I said, spreading out papers on an old crate that served as our makeshift table. "Let me explain what we're going to do and why it's going to work." Tommy and Sarah leaned in, their young faces serious in the dim light filtering through broken windows. Over the past few days, I had come to realize that their street smarts and invisibility to adults made them perfect operatives for what I had in mind. "First, Tommy, I need you to be at the hospital tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. You remember where the psychiatric evaluation offices are?" He nodded. "Third floor, east wing. I memorized the layout when Sarah was getting treated." "Good. I want you to hide in that supply closet we identified yesterday. You'll have this." I handed him a small digital recorder I had purchased with cash. "When my wife and son arrive to meet with the doctors, I want you to record everything they say." Sarah raised her hand tentatively. "What about me?" I turned to her with a smile that felt foreign after days of betrayal and anger. "You have the most important job of all. I need you to deliver something to my lawyer's office at exactly 10:30 tomorrow morning." I pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with tape. Inside this envelope are copies of all the forged documents, along with evidence of my wife's affair and my son's gambling debts. But more importantly, it contains something they don't know I have. "What?" Tommy asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Proof that I'm not actually broke. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, everything showing that my financial collapse was completely fabricated. When my lawyer receives this, he'll understand that everything my family has told him about my mental state is a lie." But the envelope was just the beginning of my plan. Over the past week, while Margaret and David thought I was spiraling into helpless poverty, I had been methodically documenting their conspiracy and preparing my counterattack. The first step had been reactivating bank accounts they didn't know existed. Years ago, following advice from a paranoid but wealthy friend, I had established several offshore accounts and domestic trusts under different legal entities. Margaret and David knew about my primary business accounts and assets, but they had no idea about the backup systems I had put in place. "Here's what they don't understand," I explained to Tommy and Sarah. "They think they've been so clever, slowly positioning themselves to take everything I own. But they've only been looking at about 60% of my actual wealth." Tommy whistled softly. "So you're like, secretly rich." "More than that, I'm liquid. I can access cash and make transfers that they can't track or stop because they don't know those accounts exist." The second part of my plan involved turning their own conspiracy against them. With James Morrison's help, I had been building a legal case that would expose not just their fraud, but their intention to commit what amounted to kidnapping and theft on a massive scale. "The beautiful thing about their plan," I continued, "is that they've documented everything. Every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every bribe they paid to those doctors. There's a paper trail for all of it." Sarah looked confused. "But won't you get in trouble for lying about being poor?" I shook my head. "Pretending to be broke isn't illegal. Forging someone's signature on legal documents is. Conspiracy to commit fraud is. Bribing medical professionals to falsify psychiatric evaluations is. They've committed actual crimes while trying to steal from someone who was never actually in danger of losing anything." The third element of my strategy was the most personally satisfying. While Margaret and David had been planning my destruction, I had been quietly investigating every aspect of their lives. What I had discovered gave me leverage they couldn't possibly have anticipated. "Tommy, remember when you followed Robert Mitchell to that construction site last Tuesday?" "Yeah, the one where he was yelling at the workers?" "I did some research on that project. Turns out Robert's company has been using substandard materials and cutting corners on safety inspections. The building they're constructing is supposed to be a senior living facility, but it's not going to pass city inspection when it's completed." I pulled out a folder filled with photographs Tommy had taken and documents I had obtained through my contacts in the construction industry. "Robert's company is about 6 months away from bankruptcy, which explains why he's so eager to get his hands on my assets. He needs my money to cover up his own failures." Sarah studied the papers with impressive focus for a 12-year-old. "So he's not actually rich?" "He's in debt for over $3 million, and when his current project fails inspection, he'll face lawsuits that will destroy him completely. Margaret thinks she's trading up for a wealthier man, but she's actually about to hitch herself to a sinking ship." The irony wasn't lost on me. My wife, who had refused to stand by me during fake poverty, was about to destroy herself chasing after a man whose real financial situation was far worse than anything I had pretended to experience. But David's situation was even more precarious. My investigation had revealed that his gambling debts weren't just large, they were owed to people who didn't accept payment plans or negotiate settlements. "I made some calls to people I know in certain circles," I told the kids, choosing my words carefully. "The men your son owes money to are very serious about collecting what they're owed. They've been patient so far because they believe David has access to family money, but that patience won't last forever." Tommy nodded grimly. "Bad people don't like being lied to." "Exactly. And when they find out that David doesn't actually have access to my money, that all his promises were based on inheritance he's never going to receive, they're going to be very unhappy with him." The final piece of my plan was the most delicate. While I wanted justice for what my family had done to me, I also wanted to protect the 2 children who had shown me more loyalty in a week than my wife and son had shown me in years. "Kids, after tomorrow, your lives are going to change dramatically. But I need you to understand that this is your choice. If you want to walk away right now, I'll give you money to get somewhere safe, and you'll never see me again." Tommy and Sarah exchanged glances. Then Tommy spoke for both of them. "We don't have anywhere else to go, and you're the first adult who's ever treated us like we matter. We're staying." Sarah nodded emphatically. "Besides, your family is mean. They deserve whatever happens to them." As we prepared to leave the warehouse and get into position for the next day's operation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of being truly understood and unconditionally supported. Margaret and David had spent decades taking my love for granted, assuming I would always be there to provide for them regardless of how they treated me. They had never considered that their actions might have consequences, or that I might eventually reach a breaking point. Tomorrow they would learn that even the most patient man has limits. The morning of the planned psychiatric evaluation, I watched from a rented car across the street as Margaret and David arrived at the hospital together. They moved with the confidence of people who believed their victory was assured, chatting casually as they walked through the main entrance. They had no idea that their conversation would be recorded, their conspiracy would be exposed, and their carefully constructed lies were about to collapse around them. More importantly, they had no idea that the man they were planning to destroy had been several steps ahead of them all along. The confrontation that ended my old life and began my new one took place not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in the very house where I had raised the son who tried to destroy me. It was 2 weeks after the failed psychiatric evaluation, and Margaret and David had no idea that their entire world was about to collapse. James Morrison had orchestrated everything perfectly. The recordings Tommy had made revealed Margaret and David discussing their timeline for having me committed, their plans for liquidating my assets, and most damning of all, their casual cruelty as they laughed about how easy it had been to manipulate the old fool. But the legal evidence was just the beginning. What happened next was a master class in consequences, finding people who thought they were untouchable. I arrived at the house at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, using the key I had never returned. Margaret and David were in the living room with Robert Mitchell, the three of them hunched over papers spread across the coffee table, papers that, according to James, were forged transfer documents for my remaining known assets. "Well," I said, stepping into the room and watching their faces drain of color, "isn't this cozy?" Margaret shot to her feet, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. David remained frozen in his chair, a pen still gripped in his hand. Robert, to his credit at least, had the intelligence to look afraid. "Harold," Margaret finally managed, her voice shaking, "you're supposed to be... Where have you been? We've been worried sick." I laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "Worried sick? Is that what you call conspiring to have me falsely committed to a psychiatric facility?" The silence that followed was deafening. David slowly set the pen down, his hands visibly trembling. Robert shifted toward the door, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Please don't leave on my account, Robert. After all, you're a very important part of this conversation." I pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table, right on top of their forged documents. "This contains recordings of your conversations, copies of the forged legal papers, evidence of the bribes you paid to Dr. Williams and Dr. Peterson, and detailed documentation of Robert's financial situation." Robert's face went ashen. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? Mitchell Development Holdings is approximately $3,200,000 in debt. Your senior living facility project is using materials that won't pass inspection, and you've been falsifying safety reports for 8 months. When that building fails its final inspection next month, you'll face lawsuits that will bankrupt you completely." I turned to Margaret, whose carefully maintained composure was cracking like old paint. "Did Robert mention any of this when you were planning your new life together? Did he tell you that the apartment you've been living in for 8 years is actually rented under his company's name, and that when his company fails, you'll be evicted?" Margaret sank back into her chair, the reality of her situation finally penetrating. "That's not—" "Harold, you don't understand. We can work this out." "Can we? The way we worked out your 8-year affair? The way we worked out David's $200,000 in gambling debts? The way we worked out your plan to steal everything I've spent my life building?" David found his voice at last. "Dad, if you would just listen." "Listen to what, son?" "To you explaining how my money was going to solve your problems, how you convinced yourself that stealing from your father was somehow justified because you needed it more than I did." I opened the folder and pulled out a specific set of documents. "Did you know that the men you owe money to have been watching our house? Did you know they've already approached your wife, Elena, asking questions about when they can expect payment?" David's face went white. Elena. In all his scheming, he had never considered that his creditors might target his own family. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice steady and calm. "Robert, you're going to leave town tonight. I've already sent copies of the evidence about your construction fraud to the city inspector and the district attorney. If you're smart, you'll be gone before they issue the warrants." Robert looked like he wanted to argue, but the fight had gone out of him. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door without another word. "Margaret," I said, turning to my wife of 42 years, "the divorce papers have already been filed. You'll receive your copy tomorrow morning. Since adultery is still grounds for fault-based divorce in this state, and since I have 8 years of evidence documenting your affair, you won't be receiving any alimony or property settlement." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Harold, please. I made mistakes, but we can fix this." "The only mistake you made was underestimating me." Everything else was a choice, a series of choices that showed me exactly who you really are. I turned to David last. This was the hardest part, because despite everything, he was still my son. "David, your gambling debts are your problem now. I won't be paying them, and I won't be bailing you out when your creditors come calling, but I'm not completely heartless." I pulled out a cashier's check and set it on the table. "This is enough to pay off your debts and start over somewhere else. It's also the last money you'll ever receive from me." David stared at the check like it might disappear. "Dad, The check comes with conditions. You'll use it to pay your debts, you'll sell your house and your cars, and you'll leave the state. If I ever see you again, if you ever contact me again, if you ever try to claim any connection to me or my money, I'll make sure your creditors know exactly where to find you." The look on his face was a mixture of relief and devastation. He understood that I was saving his life and ending our relationship at the same time. "There's one more thing you all should know," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "The man you thought you were destroying, the broken old fool living on the streets, he never existed. I've been documenting your betrayal while maintaining complete control of my finances and my life. You didn't just fail to destroy me, you revealed yourselves completely while I remained untouchable." I walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and the house belongs to a trust you've never heard of, so you'll need to be out by the end of the week." As I left my former home for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Complete freedom from people who had taken my love for granted. 6 months later, I stood in the backyard of a modest house on the outskirts of a small town 200 miles away, watching Tommy and Sarah help each other with homework at the picnic table I had built for them. The adoption papers had been finalized the month before, making official what had already become true. We were a family. Not a family bound by obligation or genetics or financial dependency, but by choice and mutual respect and genuine affection. Tommy had enrolled in the local middle school and was already showing signs of the intelligence I had always suspected he possessed. Sarah was thriving in 6th grade, her natural wariness gradually giving way to the confidence of a child who finally felt safe. "Harold," Tommy called out, "Sarah doesn't understand this math problem, and I'm not sure I'm explaining it right." I walked over to help them, marveling at how natural it felt to be needed for guidance rather than money, to be valued for my presence rather than my bank account. We never spoke about Margaret and David, but I knew through James Morrison that Margaret had indeed been evicted from Robert's apartment and was now living with her sister in another state. David had used the money I gave him to pay his debts and had moved to Oregon, where he was reportedly working construction and attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Robert Mitchell had disappeared entirely, leaving behind a trail of lawsuits and angry investors. As for me, I had discovered something remarkable. When you remove people from your life who only value what you can give them, you create space for relationships based on what you can share. That evening, as we sat around our dinner table, Tommy and Sarah chattering about their day at school, making plans for the weekend, arguing good-naturedly about what movie to watch, I realized that losing my family had been the best thing that ever happened to me. Because in losing them, I had finally found the love I had been searching for my entire life. Not the conditional, transactional love I had accepted for so many years, but the real thing. Messy and complicated and absolutely unconditional. Tommy looked up from his homework and caught me watching them with what must have been a ridiculously sentimental expression on my face. "What?" he asked, grinning. "Nothing," I said, ruffling his hair. "Just thinking about how lucky I am." And for the first time in 64 years, I truly meant it.